There are a lot of different kinds of parents that exist out there. Now, we all kind of see the different parenting tropes that exist. There are those who are the helicopter parents. There are those who are the boy mom type parents where we're just very hands off and, oh, good fall, buddy. Next time, let's maybe not climb that high. But if you do, wear a helmet. There's a lot of different kinds of parents, but just like that, there's a lot of different kinds of views of how we view God and how we view the world. And so tonight, as we dig into the first of our Deuteronomy and the Divine Person series, I want to ask you this question. If you believe in God, how do you view God's interactions with people? And so I will be starting a poll here, and you can join in on that poll and send me your answers. I'd love to see what your answers are. And so if you believe in God, how do you view the divine person? Deuteronomy is a great place to start with this discussion, simply because it shows us a view of God that's very different than some parts of Scripture. You know, when I was growing up in the church, I always heard this view of God where, like, the Old Testament God is super judgy and, you know, he's always just, like, smiting people out of nowhere. And that never really made a lot of sense to me, because you'd read passages like Deuteronomy and it wasn't the same God that I'm seeing as where these people are saying God is super judgy. And so what we see here instead is a God who loves his people and gives them instructions by which they can follow and they can pursue God in their daily lives and their daily actions. So let's dig in here. What we see in Deuteronomy, we can talk and start from Deuteronomy chapter 6. We see that they say the word Lord, and in particular the phrase, the Lord your God, a lot. It's a phrase that it seems to imply God is, you know, a Lord over us, kind of the transcendent authority figure. And if you've read the blog post that went with this week, you've kind of gotten your insights on that. If you haven't, it's still available online. Feel free to dig in. But we see that there's this authoritarian God that's mentioned. But then in the very next section of the text, we see there is an emphasis on love the Lord your God. And so there's a desire for intimacy that's here that doesn't seem to communicate that God is all authority and all transcendence. There's a mix that seems to be happening in how we view the divine person in Deuteronomy. So let's talk about this. I grew up in the 90s, and in the 90s, the very coolest thing that you could do would be wear every logo of every company that you've ever thought about buying a product from or wanted to support. And if you wanted to be really cool, you'd wear like the really snazzy, you know, I'm not going to start getting into brands because I never had them, but that's okay. That's a whole other story for a whole other heartbreak night. Here's the thing. We wear what's important to us. And in Scripture, we see that this kind of pattern existed there. When you were reading through the blog, you may have noticed that there was this idea, the command to obedient love, that commanded the Israelite people to wear something called a tefillin. Now, if you are a Hebrew scholar and I've butchered how we pronounce this, I apologize. My strong suits are more in Greek than in Hebrew, and everything comes out with a French accent, so I'm really sorry about that. But this tefillin was the idea that you would put scriptures in boxes on your wrists and on your forehead, and you would carry the scriptures around with you so that you would be remembering them constantly. Because there's nothing like washing the dishes and trying not to get scripture wet. There's nothing like working in the field and having sweat on your brow. Oh, and being reminded the word of the Lord is with me. All of these things were reminders, not only of the authority of God, but of the presence of God and our commitment to love Him. A lot of times I've heard this passage talked about in sermons, and it's all about how this reminded the people to love God. But I think it also serves to remind us that God is with us and He loves us. And sometimes, now, this may be more true for some of us during the pandemic, especially as extroverts. Sometimes we just need to be reminded that someone is present with us and we are not completely alone. Sometimes we just need that reminder. And what the Tephilim did in Scripture, it reminded the Israelites that they were not alone because the word of the Lord was with them. Now, let me take an aside here for a moment. When we see things on our wrists or hands and our forehead, a lot of times the thing that comes to mind when you look at Scripture is the mark of the beast. And I'm not going down too much of a rabbit hole here, so bear with me. What if we treated Scripture like they treated Scripture in the Old Testament? And what if instead of living in fear of some kind of mark of unholiness being in our lives in the form of a computer chip or some such thing that's contrived as the mark of the beast, what if instead we started marking ourselves by our faith? And what we think about and what we do each day becomes the mark of our faith in this world. We've all had a lot of things going on in our lives lately, and I think we've all come to notice that things are wrong in this world. The divine person calls us to live in love, and we haven't really been doing that. I have been heartbroken each day that more news has come out about unmarked children being buried in graves that their parents may have never even seen. My heart is broken for the nation of Haiti, who woke up this morning in complete turmoil over what happens next. Our hearts should be breaking over news like this and every other injustice that we see in this world, because that is what our faith calls us to do. And so instead of marking ourselves with the paints of hatred and the paints of anger, let us put on the things that remind us of our dedication to do better. Let us become and wear the symbols that the divine person has called us to wear each and every day. Remember the Lord your God. The words that we wear on our lives, they'll be apparent to others in what we do and what we say. And so for those of you who aren't believers, I would love for you to practice this in a way that makes sense to you. Find a scripture or a life verse that encourages you to live in love and carry that with you. And I've seen people write it on stones that they put in their pocket. I've seen people just learn it internally and then try to chant it like as a life practice. For those of us who are believers, I would strongly encourage you to find a scripture that definitely teaches you and reminds you. For me, as I shared in previous weeks, there are songs that I carry in my heart that are the words of Scripture. And in the moments when I need it most, those are the moments that I am reminded of these songs. We do that not only in carrying these words around with us, because lots of people could carry around lots of things. I remember wrestlers when I was growing up would have the John 3:16 on a sign, and that would be their big deal. And I'm pretty sure that they definitely weren't using it in the way that it was originally intended. So words are nothing if we don't put them into practice. Words are nothing if we don't put them into practice. When I was a teenager, not only was it the biggest thing to wear the labels on our clothing, but it was also the big thing to wear labels on bands, whether they were a sweatband or those like kitschy camp bracelets that everybody had, and they'd be like acronyms, so just phrases that were spelled out by letters. Yeah, you're welcome, children who are learning to text in gibberish. We started that. You're welcome. So when people would wear something like WWJD, they would think, what would Jesus do? And the question was, for me as a teenager, but are people actually doing what Jesus would do, or are they just asking themselves and then making a choice arbitrarily? We need to live like we're asking ourselves these kinds of questions every day, and not just wearing the question or wearing the scripture. We need to live like it actually matters, and like our neighbors actually matter to us, because they do. So as we continue the Deuteronomy and the Divine series, I would love for us to dig in and learn more, not only about who God is in the world and around us, but how we relate to Him and to one another. So that's our first 10-minute discussion on Deuteronomy and the divine person. I'll see you next week.